Welcome, engineers. My name is Travis IQ, and today we're going to talk about why you can never mint hyped NFT projects. And by never, I mean you're never successful. Other people are successful. Why not you? Let's get into it. So you haven't been able to mint any hyped mints. So there's a bunch of news around a mint, maybe the Adidas mint, for example, where Adidas released a bunch of NFTs that were going to reward users with special access to clothing and things like this. And you couldn't get one. The gas fee, the gas fees still charged because the transactions went through but weren't processed. And so you were out some money for gas fees and you didn't get the NFT and now you're frustrated. There's a bunch of other examples of this and I'll bring up a couple, but let me give you some reasons why. So one example around hyped mints and why these things are difficult for regular users to achieve, right? Normies, for example. One is, they could be in the middle of the day and there's a bunch of people trying to get them. So there's some aspect of luck involved. Without question, there's an aspect of luck. But there's also this other component. When you think about what goes on with hyped mints, for example, it's the same thing. These are unique NFTs, right? They're unique pieces of art or access or tokens or utility, right, that you're trying to get access to. It's the same thing as if a sneaker were to drop or if a new gaming console were to drop, right? There's a day and time, and then you go and you try to get this thing. And so obviously there's a large percentage of people that aren't able to get it, but there are also a large percentage of people that are. And in those environments, just like in the real world, in the digital world, in the real world, there are people who try to game the system. There are people who have friends who work at the distributors who give you access. There are people who pay people behind the scenes to grab a couple off a truck somewhere, right, to get 1, 2, or 3 of these gaming consoles when they were only supposed to get 1 at cost and then resell them. You see them pop up everywhere. Okay, so then what's the equivalent of that in the digital world? Well, the equivalent of that in the digital world is actually interacting with the smart contracts. So what we need to know before we think about what happened here is we need to understand how the smart contracts work, right? And so what happens is you've got your mint button, and this is a Web 2 front end. Right, this is traditional web front end. In the crypto world, we call it Web 2, but it's really just a traditional front end, right? Where there's a little button that says mint this thing, and when you click it, right, what happens? If you're using MetaMask on Ethereum or if you're using Phantom on Solana, a little button comes up that says approve. And what you're actually doing is it's asking you to sign a transaction. And so you're signing a transaction to interact with what's known as a smart contract. And that smart contract then does something, right? It takes in 0.3 Ethereum, for example, for this mint for Adidas, and it then mints out an NFT, a unique identifier. This is basically a non-fungible token, right? It's a unique token to you. Also, just for understanding's sake, right? That token, usually it has like an image or something like that associated with it. A lot of times this token is actually referencing an image, and that image is stored somewhere on like some decentralized infrastructure, let's say like Arweave or something like that, right? But the question here is, do you really need this Web 2 front end to interact with this smart contract? And the answer is no. You technically do not need this Web 2 front end to interact with this smart contract. And also, if this smart contract isn't set up appropriately, then we can do weird things with it, right? We can manipulate the contract, or we can understand what the contract's doing and use that knowledge to our advantage. And I'll give you a couple of examples. And by we, I mean people who are bad actors, not myself particularly, or you particularly, right? This is the reason why you and I aren't necessarily getting access to these mints the way that we probably should. And it's unfortunate, but this happens in every space. I just wanted to give you a little bit more information about what's going on behind the scenes. Okay, so this is what happens. And what you can do is potentially bypass the Web 2 front end and interact with the smart contract directly. You can look at what the smart contract is doing and manipulate based upon the information, or you can use any number of tools to give you an advantage to understand what's going on in the marketplace as well, and I'll talk about a couple of those things. Okay, so let's talk about an example. And so this actually happened with the Adidas mint. One person got away with 300 Adidas NFTs, essentially before or at the moment of mint. And so what actually happened, if you read down through the article, what happened is this person wrote their own custom smart contract. So they're a Solidity developer. That's the language that the Ethereum virtual machine uses. So a Solidity dev wrote a custom smart contract that when invoked, so one contract, right? It invoked 150 subcontracts And each one of those subcontracts minted 2 NFTs. There's been some theories around how this was actually how the person was actually able to do this, and so they had enumerated the smart contract and understood which contract they were interacting with beforehand. And Adidas probably should have done a better job of obfuscating the smart contract they were using. Maybe they shouldn't have made it public at all beforehand. A couple of things that they could have done. This isn't really a post-mortem of what to do. This is actually just talking about examples of why we aren't necessarily successful in these big hype mints. And so part of this is when it's got a lot of hype and a lot of value around Adidas dropping an NFT in the space, what happens? People, Solidity developers, whose time is usually particularly valuable, right? Because they're developers in a new Cambrian explosion of tech and ecosystem. They're really valuable people in general. Don't usually spend their time on developing smart contracts to mint regular dazed ducked NFTs or something like this. But when something big like this comes out, well, it's probably worth my time to mint 150 or 300 of these at 0.3 ETH. Right, so that's 0.3 times 100 is 30 times 3 is 90 ETH or so, plus the gas fees. It was several $100,000 in an ETH spent to mint these NFTs, with the thought that the NFTs were going to be more valuable after the mint, and in fact they were. And so this person was successful, right? They minted the NFTs. The NFTs are unique and they're stored on a decentralized ledger. It's not like you can take them back from them or anything like this. This was a successful manipulation of this smart contract, and one of the reasons, among others, right, that you were less likely to be successful when you tried to mint this, for example, if you were going to go through and do this. I'll give you another example. So another great example would be the Degenerate trash pandas on Solana. And so these Degenerate trash pandas, these little guys right here, this was a big mint associated with the Degenerate apes crew. It was their second mint, and Degenerate apes are one of the most popular NFTs on Solana. And they said, we're going to do 10,000 plus of these Degenerate trash pandas, and to avoid some of the minting issues, they actually issued tokens instead of the direct NFTs. And then you could use those tokens to mint afterwards so that you had them, so there was like a fair distribution, a bunch of other things. Okay, so they did a bunch of cool things. Well, what happened? What actually happened is, and I'll link this thread, right? But what happened is the mint was on November 24th, and unbeknownst to many, several organized groups had set up bots to snipe rare and mythic NFTs. And so what they had done is there was a vulnerability in the minting platform that is actually the primary minting platform on Solana, and you could go through and enumerate the minted NFTs before they were sent to the candy machine and distributed, right? And they were well, actually they're in the candy machine and distributed linearly. And so you could see when they were going to be distributed, and then you could mint preferentially and try and snipe those super rare mythic NFTs. And so people were getting preferentially lame or less rare NFTs because there was a group that was sniping these. So here's another example of maybe why not only you can't mint, but you don't get as good of stuff. And I'm giving you the scary things, but you're here because you're like, why can't I do this? These are some examples of what's going on in this space. It's not as rampant as maybe I'm making it seem at this point, and there are some ways to remedy this, but these are some examples. I'll give you one more. Probably the main reason why I've done this video, which is actually pretty interesting to me, was a game that recently minted called Cops Game. It's really like a clone of a game that was on Ethereum, but this game had a similar issue where their web front end was overloaded by hype. And so by hype, I mean users trying to mint. And so what happened here? So they had a mint front end, right? They had a mint here, and there was just too much traffic for the Web 2 front end to handle, and it just basically crashed and wasn't executing appropriately. But like I said earlier, these are smart contracts, right? So this is Web 2. But what about the Web 3 front? What about the Web 3 front end? That's back-end contract stuff. So what about the Web 3 contracts? Were these still running? These were still running, right? So how do you interact with the contracts on the fly? And this is where it gets to, right, having an understanding of the ecosystem, having an understanding of some of the technical implementations and being able to do it, right? And so a lot of people couldn't mint, right, this project because the Web 2 front end was broken, but anybody who was using a direct contract interaction, an example of a project that does direct contract minting is Solana Research Labs. This is a little NFT token on the Solana blockchain that gives you access to a direct contract minting suite. And so it's called Solana Research Labs, oftentimes abbreviated in the Discord SRL, right? And if we go out to this minting utility SRL, for example, what is this? The wallet address and balances, a lot of this stuff is going to be blurred out for, a lot of the stuff is blurred out for the sake of privacy and things like this. But what you can do is put in the direct contract minting ID, right? Which is, it's not contract minting CMID, it's actually Candy Machine ID, CMID. And Candy Machine is the minting utility, right? Native to Solana. And if you put in the direct ID, right? Validate that it's make sure that it's a valid CMID, it will do this for you. And then you can mint directly in a utility like this. Now, this is not normal stuff. I'm significantly technical, right? I have a background in cybersecurity, blockchain, and NFTs. And so I wouldn't expect a normie, quote unquote, to be able to do this. But this is why a lot of people were unable to mint this project, for example, and some other people in the space were able to mint it until it sold out within like 15 minutes or something like this. Again, these are examples of why it's not always successful, and especially with projects with a lot of hype, that they're minting out quickly, you're not getting access, and then you never end up with the NFT, for example. And so these types of projects, I can guarantee you that a lot of people were using this, because if you went and looked at the SRL NFT on Magic Eden, for example, it spiked in value because people were like, whoa, this is a really valuable project. It went from like 8 SOL value on Magic Eden, all that got bought up, and it went to like a floor of like 13 SOL in literally a matter of like 15 minutes. Instead of buying it for 8 SOL on one day, it would cost you 13 SOL the next day. And this is because a specific mint like the Kopsky Mint, right, was successful for people who own this token and could utilize this tool, and it was unsuccessful predominantly for people who couldn't. And so people saw the value, and what happens when people see the value and you have a direct representation of that value with NFTs, the NFT price goes up, which is, it's great for this utility, and it's great for those token holders, but it's also a detriment to people who are, let's say, normies, for example. Okay, so what can you do? I would say, right, there are a couple things you can do. Obviously, you can get familiar with the ecosystem and the infrastructure. You don't have to become a Solidity developer, but you could use these types of tools that are relatively intuitive. They take some time to learn. The second thing is, you don't always have to mint hyped projects, right? A lot of people are getting into this space because they want to, see 100x or something like this. Well, you're not going to see 100x normally with a super hyped project, at least in a short period of time, right? Where you're going to see 100x is with a not so hyped project, right? A project that you think is cool, that has a small team, that is not in the mainstream media until 8, 6, 10 weeks down the road. 24 weeks down the road. I don't know. It depends on how long these things take to develop a following, to develop some really cool tools and utilities, and then become a little bit more mainstream. So my suggestions are either become more familiar with the ecosystem if this is something that you're really passionate about, or two, right, if it's something that you're moderately passionate about, but want to try and take a risk and a gamble or something like that, try and find a smaller project that you think is interesting, that you enjoy the team and you enjoy the roadmap, and then ride it out. That's what a lot of the people in the Solana ecosystem have done, and the AVAX ecosystem and the early Ethereum ecosystems have done. It's pretty cool. I'll talk a little bit more about that and some some ways to up your knowledge base very, very quickly in a subsequent video. But I think that's pretty much what we wanted to cover. We talked about tools, we talked about the way that these tools are manipulated, we talked about the way the contracts are manipulated, and the way the Web 2 front end oftentimes doesn't work with all this hype. I know it was a lot of info. Maybe go back and listen to a little bit more. Ask me some questions in the comments down below. If you like the video, give it a like and subscribe. If not, engineer, break stuff, have fun. We'll see you next time.